May 31st, 2022. It's Tuesday in Albany, New York, the capital of the Empire State. But there's nothing imperial about the town itself.
Albany is known as Small Albany because it's got like a small town feel. It's lots of festivals and fairs, very close-knit.
Albany's a nice area, a lot of history in this city.
But this morning, one of the city's residents, a Sid Hemingway Powell, has mysteriously gone silent.
I called her Sunday. She didn't answer, so I'm like, maybe she just wants some time to herself.
Sid was known for just dropping off the radar. Sometimes she just needed peace of mind.
But after 2 more days of silence, Jackie Powell is starting to get worried.
I kept calling her and she's not answering her phone.
She hadn't heard from her since the 27th.
So she decides to go to her daughter's apartment.
Sid, it's Mom. Are you there?
I was ringing her bell, and she never came.
When there's no response, she calls the Albany police.
Jackie Powell called for a welfare check on her daughter.
Officers from our patrol division responded out there along with building management to access her apartment.
Oh, these are passports. Okay. This will get you into the world.
So you can just get us in now?
Yeah.
But it turns out they don't need a key.
When they got to her specific apartment, it was unlocked. It was closed, but it was unlocked.
The patrol officer tells Jackie and the property manager to wait outside.
They told me, we can't just let you in.
The patrol officer walked in. Nothing seemed in disarray or out of the ordinary. Just calling out Sid's name, trying to get some response.
Are you in here, Sid?
He goes to the back bedroom, and Sid is on her bed. She looks like she's sleeping.
But as the officer approaches her, he quickly realizes this is a sleep that she'll never wake up from.
Sid was unfortunately located deceased.
But Jackie's daughter isn't just dead. She's been murdered.
Sid had been shot in the head twice.
"30-year-old Sid Hemingway Powell had been a fighter all her life.
She don't mean any harm to nobody. She fights for love, she fights for her friends, her family.
And she did it with style.
Sid was always super outgoing and everything. She always had a lot of friends.
For Sid, the excitement never stopped.
Sid was the life of the party. Sid and I both loved to dance, but Sid will always try to outdo everyone, including myself.
Sid was like a wild child, but in a good way.
As she got older, Sid started participating in modeling shows, rapping, and performing on YouTube.
She performed under the name Chum Chum, and everybody loved it. She had a real talent for it.
And she dreamed of making a difference.
Sid wanted to change the world, and she believed that it started with you. We have to make the change.
Also a diligent student, Sid earned an associate's degree at a community college. But she wasn't finished.
She enrolled at the University of Albany. She wanted to get her degree to become a physician's assistant and then go on to become a doctor.
She wanted to help people. That was her thing.
In 2022, she graduated with a degree in biology.
Whatever challenges came her way, she was able to go beyond that because she was empowered to make a difference, not just for herself, but also for her community.
She was just amazing. She's the type of person that if you say, I'm going to the moon, she's gonna read up on it, we're gonna build this rocket, you could do it.
They celebrated her graduation with a party where she was surrounded by all those that loved her.
It was always just nothing but love at the end of the day.
But now,
Sid?
Only a few days after the happy occasion, Sid has been found murdered in her apartment.
Sid had sustained 2 gunshot wounds to her head.
She was beyond help.
The officer comes outside and tells her mom, Jackie, that Sid had passed away.
Did you find her?
Ma'am?
He was like, she's deceased. I just started crying.
Despite the shock, Sid's mother wants to help.
Do you have any idea who may have done something like this?
Nobody.
She was popular with all of Albany.
But Jackie Powell does tell police she was always afraid something like this might happen.
Why is that?
She was trans.
This might be a hate crime.
"30-year-old Sid Hemingway Powell seemed destined for success.
She just graduated with a biology degree and was looking forward to starting her medical career as a physician's assistant.
Sid has so many goals that she wanted to achieve.
But now, after not hearing from her for a few days, Sid's worried mother has asked police to do a welfare check on her.
Albany police went to Sid's apartment and, upon making entry, located Sid, deceased. She was shot in the head twice.
Sid's mother tells the police that in the back of her mind, she'd always feared something like this might happen.
Her mother had worried about her safety because Sid was transgender.
Is that why she was murdered?
We wondered, was this going to be some kind of hate crime?
Or there could be a more personal motive.
Did somebody just not like her? We don't know what happened.
Was this an event where someone had met someone at a bar and went home and then was surprised that someone was trans? That was a fear.
As Sid's mother is taken to the station for a formal statement, homicide detectives arrive to begin the investigation.
Myself and Detective O'Donovan went to Sid's house and began to process and work the scene.
They start with the victim.
She was located in bed, covers pulled over her. She looked almost to be like sleeping.
On the left side of her bed, next to the wall, there were pillows propped up that looked like someone was just sitting on the bed next to her.
Investigators also see 2 gunshot wounds to her head.
Sid was shot in the left temple and also in the right temple.
Then, looking around the room, detectives find a single shell casing on the floor.
Somebody had taken the other shell casing, trying to hide what they did.
Detectives quickly rule out robbery as a motive.
The place wasn't ransacked. It didn't appear that money or credit cards or anything else was missing.
The one thing detectives couldn't find was the victim's phone. They suspected the killer didn't want the police to know who she'd been communicating with before she was killed.
That would reinforce what investigators suspect. Sid knew her killer.
Sid's door was not forced, and all the windows were locked. So whoever did it was allowed in there.
It had to be somebody she opened the door for and let them in.
In fact, the killer may well have been someone close to her.
In homicide cases, 2/3 of the cases that the victims are transgender, the people who end up killing are, intimate partners.
Unfortunately, the apartment complex didn't have any security cameras. So there was no video that could have identified the killer.
After finishing up at the apartment, detectives return to their office to talk to Sid's mother.
The first thing I want to ask about is, when did Sid transition?
It was right out of high school.
Sid's mother admits that at first it was hard for her to deal with the change.
I was mad, but we got around it. I accepted it. It took a little, not long, but it took a little minute for me to come around.
Eventually, Sid's whole family embraced her new identity.
Your personality doesn't change. It doesn't change who you are. The soul that you have
Was there anybody that had a problem with Sid being trans?
No. She got along with everybody.
If you had a problem with her, that was your problem, not her problem.
But Sid's mother admits she doesn't know much about her daughter's personal life.
She was private for the most part. She really didn't talk much about her relationships.
However, Jackie says that a few days ago, her daughter had called and shared something very important about her life.
She was like, "Yeah, I got something to tell you. I don't want you to be upset."
She told me that she had HIV.
Detectives in Albany, New York, investigating the murder of a Sid Hemingway Powell, have just learned that not long before her death, the 30-year-old trans woman had tested positive for HIV.
She called me, she was like, "Mommy, they said I had HIV."
She was like, "I messed up." And I'm like, I immediately start crying.
Sid's mother tried to remain positive.
I was like, "Babe, you're gonna be all right."
This is 2022. The advancements in medication and technology, it's been tremendous. You can live a long, healthy, normal life with this situation as long as you take care of yourself.
While HIV is no longer a death sentence, detectives do wonder if it had something to do with Sid's murder.
The biggest takeaway from Sid's apartment was that whoever killed her was allowed into that apartment and was someone that she allowed to get in her bed with her.
It was possible that her killer was a lover who had just found out about the test results, who also tested positive, and maybe blamed Sid.
But Jackie doesn't know who that could have been.
My kids don't really tell me about their private life because I start asking questions. I got 100 questions.
After talking to a Sid's mother, detectives interview other members of her family, hoping Sid may have confided in them.
She just wanted the same thing that every girl wants.
She wants somebody who's gonna love her openly.
But for Sid, that was sometimes hard to find.
Sid's sister told detectives that Sid would sometimes date men who were on the down low, men who presented as straight to the world.
A man like that could certainly fit the profile of the killer being constructed by detectives.
If you're on the down low, if you're ashamed and embarrassed to be with this person, imagine how you'd react if they tell you they have HIV and you're at risk.
Now detectives are looking for a man in Sid's recent past. But can her family give them a name?
Rumors started flooding in and everybody started saying different names.
But there's one name in particular that keeps coming up.
Very early on, Ayer's name was being provided to us by different family and friends.
26-year-old Ayer Robinson had known Sid for quite some time.
Albany is a small city, and the Robinsons and Hemingways had a cousin or two in common, and they kinda came up near each other.
Sid and Ayer would often hang out and smoke weed, but eventually they took things to the next level.
Sid and Ayer Robinson had been together in a non-exclusive relationship for a long time.
I know about their relationship for, I think, 5 years. It may have been even longer than that.
However, those close to Ayer didn't know.
Nobody from his life at that time knew.
He has children and baby moms and things like that, whatever. It was obviously a lot more difficult for him.
Given the complicated nature of their relationship, police suspect Ayer may have been involved in Sid's murder.
Right then and there, he's a person of interest. He's somebody we're definitely going to want to speak to at some point.
But when detectives ask if they suspect Ayer had something to do with Sid's death, the family finds it hard to believe.
Sid definitely loved Ayer. She mentioned it many, many times.
Every time she talks about it, she's like, "Oh, but he loves me. We just, we can't be together."
And according to Sid's brother, Ayer knew about Sid's recent HIV diagnosis.
Sid told her brother that she had shared the news with him soon after she got her test results.
And though Ayer is at the top of the list of people police need to talk to, he isn't the only name on it.
According to Sid's siblings, she had been seeing another guy, someone they knew less about than Ayer.
But we actually never met the guy.
They knew him only as Big Papa.
Sid's friends and family were all aware of Big Papa, but the only person who had seen him was Sid's brother Amir, and that occurred on a FaceTime.
Can you describe him for me?
He was a white guy, older guy.
And he had money to burn.
She would ask him for stuff or whatever, and he would give it to her. That was kind of the relationship with him.
Big Papa got referred to as a sugar daddy.
He would take her to clubs and parties, and he would let her use his car when she needed to go somewhere.
But she never told you his name?
No, never.
Hoping to track down both Ayer and Big Papa, investigators subpoena Sid's phone records.
They also subpoenaed her credit card, social media, and bank accounts. Anything that might help track her movements in her final days.
While waiting for results from the subpoenas, detectives received the results of the autopsy.
The autopsy confirmed that there were 2 shots fired into her head, both at close range.
There was some stippling around the wound, and there was damage to the skin, consistent with a gun being pressed against the head and fired.
The time of death was late Friday night or early Saturday morning, sometime before 6 a.m.
But who was with Sid late that night? A call from Sid's mom provides a possible answer.
Homicide?
There is something that she hadn't mentioned that might be important.
She stated she had been with Sid a couple days prior. Sid had been FaceTiming a male in Louisiana.
His name was DJ Barnes.
They had met online. They were messaging over Facebook.
But it was more than just an online relationship.
Sid had actually bought him a bus ticket to come up here from Louisiana. DJ was going to be coming into town before the date of Sid's death.
Was he some kind of online predator?
Detectives have just learned that before she was murdered, a Sid Hemingway Powell was planning a first-time meetup with a man she met online.
Sid had been communicating online with a man named DJ Barnes, back and forth, and it was very flirtatious.
DJ and Sid had met through social media, and there was a plan for him to come to Albany to visit her.
Had DJ traveled to Albany to see Sid and then killed her?
That was another question that needed to be answered.
Maybe the meeting didn't go how DJ hoped it would. Since they never met in person, maybe he didn't know Sid was a trans woman.
When detectives get access to Sid's phone records, the first contact information they pull is for DJ Barnes.
Detective Lawyer conducted a phone interview with him, and he admitted to having some sort of online relationship with her.
But he insists he had nothing to do with her death.
He said he learned about what happened through social media, and that he was sad he never actually got to meet Sid in person.
He planned on trying to come up and see her, but he said it never ended up happening.
So detectives ask him about the bus ticket to Albany that Sid had bought him.
He said his boss never ended up giving him the time off, so he never used the bus ticket.
Investigators contact the bus company to confirm DJ's story.
The bus ticket was never cashed in.
Albany police were able to show that he didn't leave Louisiana.
With DJ eliminated as a suspect, detectives turn their attention to Sid's alleged sugar daddy, the man known as Big Papa.
I never met him. I never seen him in person.
But now, detectives are able to identify him.
We figured out through her phone records Big Papa's real name.
He's a 60-year-old Albany resident named Kyle Collins.
The investigators ran his name through a police database, and they found a very minimal criminal record. The worst thing was a fairly recent charge of petty larceny.
But when detectives head to the address on his arrest record, there's nothing there.
It was just an empty lot. If he lived there before, he doesn't now.
When investigators call him, though, they have more luck.
Hello? We were able to finally get in contact with him by phone, but he kept the interview very short.
What exactly was your connection with her?
According to Kyle, they talked on the phone fairly regularly, but it had been nearly a year since he'd seen her in person.
Kyle had not seen her in a while, and his reason was that Sid was too expensive for him.
What do you mean?
Kyle says that Sid liked to party and go to clubs, and that she'd ask him for money.
All right, look, I'm gonna ask you straight up. Did you have anything to do with her murder?
Absolutely not.
He even claims he was out of town the night Sid died, and his phone's GPS data can confirm it.
A follow-on of his phone records, he showed not to be in the area of Sid's apartment on the night she was murdered.
There was no indication that Big Papa did any harm to Sid.
But after clearing Kyle Collins, investigators get another possible lead.
Detectives were contacted by another one of Sid's friends who said she was hanging out with Sid at her apartment on the Thursday before the murder.
While she was there, Ayer Robinson came over.
What happened then?
She had asked him to go into the bedroom just to talk.
And when they came back, she could tell something was wrong.
The energy was off. She wasn't really there.
What about Ayer?
He didn't really say a word.
I'm just gonna go.
All right. Will call me later?
Yeah. Oh.
When her friend finally asked what was wrong, Sid said she'd received some bad medical news.
What is going on?
I went to the doctor and they told me I have cancer.
Oh my God, Sid. I am so sorry.
Detectives know that Sid didn't have cancer, but she had recently learned that she was HIV positive.
Could that be what Sid told Ayer in the bedroom?
I don't know. Maybe.
To find out more about Sid's diagnosis, detectives contact her doctor.
After getting several HIPAA waivers and consents, we were able to interview medical staff at the Infectious Disease Center.
A staff member says she remembers speaking to Sid when she came in for testing, and that she wasn't alone.
She came in with a guy.
She was accompanied by a black male who also requested HIV testing.
Do you remember who it was?
I can't tell you his name.
Was the man Ayer Robinson?
Ayer Robinson was seeing Sid on the low.
Could an HIV diagnosis be the motive behind the murder?
Detectives investigating the murder of a Sid Hemingway Powell have learned that when she went to a local clinic for an HIV test, she was accompanied by a black male.
The man had also been tested for HIV, but because of patient confidentiality, the clinic staff could not release his name.
Was Ayer Robinson the man with Sid at the clinic? Or was it another boyfriend investigators have yet to identify?
We'll be getting a court order to unlock the man's records.
Okay.
When detectives get their warrant, their suspicions are confirmed.
Ayer Robinson was the man who came with Sid to get HIV tested on the morning of the murder.
Was he still with her that night when she was murdered?
We had determined that Ayer Robinson was a suspect, but we wanted to keep building. We knew this was going to be a circumstantial case.
Detectives start by getting Ayer's phone records to track his movements after they left the clinic.
We're able to get where their phones were located at certain times. We're able to see they went to a nearby McDonald's, which is in walking distance to the clinic they had gone to.
They enter the restaurant and stay there for a bit, presumably having a meal together.
After that, Sid went to her apartment, and Ayer left in another direction.
We then track him all throughout the city until he goes into a corner store.
Detectives are able to track Ayer's movements until finally he returned to Sid's apartment.
Ayer came back to Sid's apartment around 8 o'clock that night. That was only minutes before Sid made her last social media post.
The data shows Ayer stayed in Sid's apartment until early the next morning, when both phones left the building.
The GPS data showed the phones traveling down the road toward the Albany airport and then stopping at a hotel.
Detectives immediately request footage for any of the hotel's exterior surveillance cameras.
The hotel was affixed with security cameras, which we were able to review. As soon as we did that, that's when it got good.
The video shows a car pull up, and a black male gets out.
He just starts smashing this phone on the ground, to the point where he actually has to take his crossbody bag off because it's bouncing so hard.
He then goes over to the dumpster and throws out the cell phone and his sweatshirt.
Investigators can't be sure that Ayer is the man in the video.
You couldn't determine who the person was, but you could tell it was a black male.
However, the investigation of the hotel ultimately yields important evidence.
Through our review of video surveillance, we're able to get a license plate to obtain a registered owner of that vehicle.
The owner is a known friend of Ayer Robinson.
Now, they didn't just have a guy who matched Ayer's description. They had a guy who looked like Ayer driving one of his friend's cars with Ayer's phone in it.
All of that circumstantial evidence is enough to obtain a warrant for Ayer's arrest.
We were conducting surveillance on Ayer Robinson's house, and if he came out, we were going to detain him.
While they're watching the house, Ayer comes outside, but he quickly spots the detectives.
He ended up fleeing on foot.
Please stop! Ayer Robinson proceeds to go in a full sprint down the street.
There's a short foot chase where he discards drugs.
He's dropping something!
The chase comes to an abrupt end.
Some good Samaritan opens his car door into Ayer to stop him. Ayer Robinson is taken into custody.
After the arrest, officers search the house where Ayer was staying.
A quantity of narcotics, along with a loaded firearm, were recovered.
But the gun is a different caliber from the shell casing recovered beside Sid's bed.
We never recovered the murder weapon. We believe it went in the dumpster along with his hoodie and Sid's phone.
But the police find one more piece of evidence, one that could make their case.
The individual that's destroying the phone in the video surveillance is equipped with a crossbody bag.
Inside Ayer's room, they found a crossbody bag.
we believed it was the same one.
Inside, they see what appears to be dried blood.
That's our evidence.
In a search of Ayer Robinson's house, detectives have found what appears to be dried blood inside a crossbody bag, seemingly identical to the one seen in security video on the man they believe killed a Sid Hemingway Powell.
Detectives believed that blood spatter got on the gun when the 2 fatal shots were fired.
Based on the wounds Sid had, we believed that it was a close contact gunshot. The belief was that after they shot Sid, they would have reholstered their handgun into the crossbody bag.
With Ayer in custody, the detectives are ready to confront him with what they found.
Ayer Robinson's transported down to our detective office and interviewed by Detective O'Donovan and myself.
The detectives tell Ayer that they know he's been having sex with Sid.
People told me they heard you saying you love this person.
Right.
Ayer ultimately admitted he was in a relationship with Sid.
I laid with her, I chilled with Sid, you feel what I'm saying?
But he denied testing positive for HIV the morning of the murder.
No, I didn't get no bad news that day.
But the detectives know both he and Sid tested positive when they went to the clinic.
It's not even supposed to be, that's supposed to be confidential.
Ayer also denies having anything to do with her death.
That's crazy.
Yeah, well, that's what we're here to clear up.
So the detectives switch gears to the night of the murder.
So we know that you go over to Sid's house on Thursday the 26th, and you're the last person that's with her while she's alive.
I don't think I was the last, though.
Okay. At any point, do you take Sid's phone?
No.
Ayer just thought we didn't know as much as we knew.
The detectives show Ayer proof that his phone and Sid's were in the same locations after the murder.
We showed him his phone records for the night of incident.
And they tell him they have him on video smashing her phone.
And you're on video getting out of that car, throwing a phone on the ground. Do you remember any of that?
Yeah, angry because she went through my phone.
Ayer also has an explanation for why he's on video throwing his hoodie in the dumpster.
I had liquor all over my hoodie.
Okay.
He was quick on his feet with answers to stuff.
He even has an explanation for the blood found in the crossbody bag during the search of his home.
He came up with a wild story of how Sid had gotten her finger pricked at the doctor's, and she had used a tissue to stop the bleeding and gave it to him.
But there's one question he doesn't have a ready answer to.
We asked Ayer if, when he left the apartment, Sid was bleeding at any point. After about 2 minutes of silence from Ayer, he stated no.
Ayer insists he can't help them.
Bro, I didn't do that to Sid, bro.
Still, after their interview, Ayer Robinson is booked on a second-degree murder charge.
New York's first-degree murder statute is not for what we would consider the more common homicides that occur. It is for somebody who kills a police officer or somebody who almost like plans like an assassination.
When Sid's family hears the news, they are thankful that it seems he is going to pay for what he did.
When I found out that Ayer was arrested, I was happy. So many murders go unsolved, especially for transgender individuals. A lot of times that we don't see the resources put behind those investigations to help actually solve those murders.
In October of 2023, Ayer Robinson goes on trial for murder in the Albany City Court.
Ayer just seemed very nonchalant, like a smug, I'm going to get away with it type of attitude.
And in her opening, The prosecutor admits she doesn't know why Ayer killed Sid.
I think Sid being a trans woman was a large factor, and Ayer maybe not being comfortable yet with admitting that he loved a trans woman. Thankfully, I don't have to prove a motive in New York. I only have to prove the elements of the crime.
Because according to Sid's family, she hadn't given Ayer HIV. It was the other way around.
Sid's literal words to me were, I need to know his results because once I know his results, I'll know where I got it from.
So according to the prosecution, receiving his positive diagnosis the morning of the murder was likely the catalyst for his actions.
Ayer gets his rapid test. So later in the day, there's a phone call to him from the health provider that says, hey, you're positive. That's the night he kills Sid.
When he went to see her that night, he had a gun in his crossbody bag.
Ayer knew what he was going to do when he went over there.
Are you sure you're okay?
Yeah. I mean, it is what it is.
Okay.
He waited till Sid fell asleep.
Then he took out his gun.
The wicked truth of the matter is he shot my baby in the head. He thought she was alive and went and shot her on the other side of the head.
He gets up, picks up one of the shell casings, and he leaves.
The prosecution also shows the jury the security video of Ayer getting rid of the evidence.
He smashed Sid's phone and threw the phone, the gun, and his blood-stained hoodie into a dumpster.
Instead of disputing the evidence, the defense focuses on Sid and her lifestyle.
The defense attorney really victim shamed her in this case. He painted Sid as this promiscuous girl, as a prostitute.
They try to paint Sid in a trial as some type of sexual deviant. That's just crazy.
It's one thing to defend your client. It's another to go after the dead and shame her the way they did.
But the jury finds the evidence more persuasive than the attacks on Sid's character.
Ayer Robinson was found guilty of murder.
When the verdict came in, I was very relieved. For my first time in my life having faith in the American justice system.
And the judge imposes the harshest sentence possible.
Murder in the second degree, the maximum punishment allowable in New York State is 25 years to life.
It's a welcome relief to Sid's family.
I was just glad that we have answers, that we have a resolution to all of this, because so many families don't.
And Sid's family can take solace in the knowledge that she always lived her life with love and compassion, and without apology.
She didn't want to be seen as just a transgender woman. She wanted her transition to be second to her success and who she was as a person.
Don't worry about how people feel about you. Be you and be the best version of you.
She has so many dreams. Rapper, doctor. I used to be like, babe, what you gonna do? I'm gonna do it all, Mom. I'm gonna do it all.
There are murders that shock a town, and then there are murders that become part of its memory. The kind people still whisper about years later. The kind that changes the way neighbors look at one another. The kind that leaves behind a question so simple, so brutal that no amount of time can bury it. Who killed Nona Dirksmeyer? On December 15, 2005, 19-year-old Nona Dirksmeyer was found dying inside her Russellville, Arkansas apartment. She was a college student. She had competed in beauty pageants. She was young, recognizable, and by all appearances building a future. But inside that apartment, something had gone terribly wrong. Nona had suffered a violent beating. The living room was marked by blood. A young woman's life had been reduced to a crime scene. The call for help came quickly, but not quickly enough. Her boyfriend, Kevin Jones, had been trying to reach her. Calls went unanswered. Messages received no response. Eventually, he and his mother went to the apartment. What they found would follow them for years. Nona was there. She was not responding. The emergency call was made. Paramedics arrived. Police arrived. And within minutes, Russellville had a murder investigation. But the investigation would soon become something much larger. It would become a battle over evidence, a battle over police work, a battle over competing theories, a battle over two men whose lives became permanently connected to a crime neither the courts nor the evidence could ultimately resolve. At first, investigators focused heavily on Kevin Jones. He was the boyfriend. He had been trying to contact Nona. He had been present when her body was discovered. Police questioned him repeatedly. His behavior, his statements, and his movements became the center of suspicion. Investigators believed there were inconsistencies. A polygraph examination became part of the investigation. Questions accumulated. And in a case like this, suspicion can move faster than evidence. Jones was eventually charged with Nona's murder. The town watched. The case attracted enormous attention. Nona had been a young beauty pageant contestant and college student. Her death was violent enough to generate headlines far beyond Russellville. People wanted an answer. Families wanted justice. Investigators wanted a conviction. But wanting an answer is not the same thing as proving one. In July 2007, after a highly publicized trial, Kevin Jones was acquitted. The prosecution had failed to convince the jury beyond a reasonable doubt that he was Nona's killer. And suddenly the case was not over. It was worse. Because if Kevin Jones had not killed Nona, then someone else had. And the question became even more frightening. Who? The investigation shifted. A new suspect emerged. Gary Dunn lived near Nona's apartment. He was not a stranger from some distant town. He was part of the same physical environment. He had access to the apartment complex. And investigators began examining his movements and his statements concerning the day Nona died. Then came the evidence that changed everything. DNA associated with Dunn was reportedly found on a condom wrapper recovered from Nona's apartment. That discovery did not automatically answer the question of murder. DNA can establish contact. It does not necessarily establish when that contact occurred, why it occurred, or who committed a homicide. But in a case already damaged by uncertainty, the evidence became explosive. The investigation turned toward Dunn. His alibi became a major issue. Investigators examined his account of where he had been on December 15, 2005. Questions emerged about whether his story could be independently confirmed. Later investigative work challenged portions of the original handling of his alibi. And suddenly the case had a new center. Gary Dunn. But there was another problem. The evidence against him was not simple. There was no clean confession. No undisputed eyewitness who watched Nona's murder from beginning to end. No single piece of evidence that closed every gap. Instead, there were fragments. DNA. Alibi questions. Statements. Conflicting interpretations. And the shadow of the first trial. Because Kevin Jones had already been acquitted. That meant the prosecution could not simply erase him from the story. The defense knew it. The courtroom knew it. And the public knew it. The question was no longer merely whether Gary Dunn could be connected to Nona's apartment. The question was whether the state could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was the person who killed her. In 2010, Dunn went on trial for capital murder. The courtroom became the latest battlefield. Prosecutors presented evidence intended to show that Dunn's alibi was unreliable. Testimony raised questions about his movements. His estranged wife, Jennifer Dunn, provided testimony concerning his behavior, including an earlier incident in which she said she saw him coming from Nona's apartment during the early morning hours weeks before the murder. That testimony was dramatic. But dramatic evidence is not necessarily decisive evidence. The defense attacked the investigation itself. They pointed toward Kevin Jones. They reminded jurors that Jones had already been accused, tried, and acquitted. They argued that the evidence against Dunn was circumstantial. And they challenged the interpretation of the DNA evidence. The courtroom heard competing stories. One side said the pieces fit. The other said the pieces were being forced together. Then came the moment every murder trial eventually reaches. The jury was asked to decide. And it could not. The jury deadlocked. The judge declared a mistrial. There would be no verdict. No guilty. No, not guilty. Just uncertainty. For Nona's family, that distinction was devastating. A mistrial does not answer the question of who killed someone. It simply means the jury could not reach the required conclusion. The state could try again. And it did. In 2011, Gary Dunn faced another jury. Again, the case returned to the same fundamental conflict. The prosecution believed Dunn was responsible. The defense continued to point toward the possibility that Kevin Jones, despite his acquittal, had been the real killer. The evidence was examined again. The arguments were repeated. The theories collided. And once again, the jury could not reach a verdict. Another mistrial. Another courtroom failure to produce an answer. At that point, the case had become more than a murder investigation. It had become a portrait of how difficult it can be to reconstruct a violent crime years after the fact. Every minute matters in a murder investigation. Every contaminated surface matters. Every statement matters. Every missing record matters. Every assumption made in the first hours can influence everything that comes afterward. And the Dirksmeyer case carried all of those dangers. The original investigation had focused heavily on Jones. Later investigators focused heavily on Dunn. The same crime scene became the foundation for competing interpretations. The same evidence was examined through different theories. The same unanswered questions survived one prosecution after another. And somewhere in the middle of all of it was Nona. A 19-year-old woman who never got the chance to explain what happened to her. That is what makes a cold case so haunting. The victim cannot correct the record. Cannot challenge a theory. Cannot tell investigators that a suspect is wrong. Cannot explain a missing detail. Cannot say what she saw. The investigation must speak for her. And when the investigation cannot produce a final answer, the silence becomes permanent. More than 20 years have now passed since Nona Dirksmeyer's death. The apartment where she was found is no longer simply a crime scene in the public imagination. The headlines have faded. The courtroom testimony has become old news. People who once followed every development have grown older. But the fundamental question remains. Who killed Nona? Was it Gary Dunn? The prosecution believed it was. Investigators developed evidence pointing toward him. His alibi was questioned. DNA evidence became central to the case. His name became inseparable from the investigation. Yet 2 juries failed to convict him. That matters. A criminal accusation is not a conviction. A suspect is not automatically a killer. And a theory, no matter how compelling, is not the same as proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Then there is Kevin Jones. He was the first major suspect. He was prosecuted. He stood trial. And a jury acquitted him. That verdict cannot simply be erased because another theory later emerged. The result is an uncomfortable collision between suspicion and law. The public may believe one story. Investigators may believe another. A defense attorney may argue a third. But a criminal conviction requires something more. It requires evidence strong enough to survive the highest burden the law demands. And in Nona's case, that burden was never met against anyone. The years continued. The case became one of those Arkansas murders that people remembered even when they could no longer remember every detail. They remembered the young beauty queen. They remembered the blood. They remembered the boyfriend. They remembered the neighbor. They remembered the trials. They remembered the deadlocked juries. And above all, they remembered that no one walked away from a courtroom carrying a final verdict for Nona. There is a particular cruelty in that. Because when a murder remains unresolved, the victim does not simply lose her future. Her story becomes permanently unfinished. Every theory creates another possibility. Every possibility creates another question. Every question leads back to the same night. December 15, 2005. A quiet Arkansas community. An apartment. A young woman. And a crime that would eventually consume years of investigation. What happened inside that apartment? Why was Nona attacked? Who entered? Who left? What did the killer know? What did the killer believe investigators would discover? And was something overlooked during those first critical hours? These questions are not cinematic inventions. They are the natural consequences of a case that never reached a final criminal conviction. That is what makes the story so disturbing. Not because there is one terrifying answer hidden somewhere in the darkness, but because there may be several competing answers, and the evidence has never been strong enough to eliminate every reasonable doubt. The case also became a cautionary story about investigative certainty. Once investigators begin to believe they know who committed a crime, every new piece of evidence can be interpreted through that belief. An innocent detail can look suspicious. A suspicious detail can look decisive. A contradiction can become proof. An explanation can become an excuse. And when the first theory collapses, the investigation must rebuild itself from the ground up. The Dirksmeyer case demonstrates how difficult that can be. The original focus on Jones produced a trial. His acquittal forced investigators to reconsider. The investigation then turned toward Dunn. His prosecution produced not one conviction, but two deadlocked juries. And with each failed trial, the public was left with the same question. What did the investigators miss? Maybe the answer lies in the physical evidence. Maybe it lies in a statement that was misunderstood. Maybe it lies in an alibi that was never fully reconstructed. Maybe it lies in a person who was never regarded as important enough during the first hours. Or maybe the truth is buried somewhere in the evidence already examined, hidden behind years of competing interpretations. That possibility is what keeps cold cases alive. Because evidence does not become meaningless simply because time passes. Sometimes technology changes. Sometimes records are re-examined. Sometimes old witnesses remember something differently. Sometimes a forgotten detail suddenly becomes important. And sometimes a case that appeared frozen for decades begins moving again, because one small piece finally makes sense. But until that happens, Nona's case remains suspended between what investigators believe and what the courts have been able to prove. There is no final verdict naming her killer. There is no courtroom confession that settles the matter. There is no official ending that can close the story. And that is why the headline must be written carefully. More than 20 years have passed. But the killer did not finally confess. Not according to the public record. The mystery remains. And perhaps that is the most haunting headline of all. Nona Dirksmeyer was 19 when her life ended. She should have been thinking about classes, relationships, family, the future. Instead, her name became permanently attached to a murder investigation that would span years. Her photograph became an image associated with a question. Her apartment became a symbol. Her death became a case file. And the people who loved her were left waiting for something that every family of a homicide victim deserves. An answer. Not a theory. Not suspicion. Not another deadlocked jury. An answer. The passage of time can make a murder feel distant to everyone except the people who knew the victim. For them, December 15th never becomes ancient history. It remains a date. A sound. A phone call. A memory of someone who should still be alive. That is the part of a cold case the headlines cannot capture. The years may erase details from the public mind. They do not erase grief. And they do not transform uncertainty into truth. Today, the name Nona Dirksmeyer still carries the weight of an unfinished investigation. The young woman from Russellville remains at the center of a case involving 2 accused men, multiple investigations, disputed evidence, and juries that could not reach a unanimous conclusion. The courts produce proceedings. The investigators produce theories. The evidence produce questions. But no final answer. And somewhere beyond the courtroom transcripts, beyond the old newspaper headlines, beyond the photographs and television reports, the essential mystery remains exactly where it was from the beginning. Someone killed Nona Dirksmeyer. Someone knew what happened inside that apartment. Someone may have seen something. Someone may have remembered something. And somewhere perhaps there is a detail that has not yet been understood. That is the terrifying thing about an unresolved murder. The truth does not disappear. It simply waits. It waits inside old evidence. Inside forgotten memories. Inside statements that were once dismissed. Inside questions that investigators thought they had already answered. And it waits in the silence that follows every failed prosecution. More than 20 years after Nona's death, Russellville has changed. People have moved away. Buildings have changed. Technology has changed. Investigative methods have changed. But the central question has survived every year that has passed. Who killed Nona Dirksmeyer? For now there is no courtroom answer. No final conviction. No definitive confession. Only a young woman's name, a family still marked by loss, and a murder that became one of Arkansas's most enduring mysteries. The headlines eventually stopped. The cameras left. The juries went home. The courtroom doors closed. But the question remained. And until the evidence finally speaks clearly enough to end the doubt, the story of Nona Dirksmeyer will remain exactly what it has been for more than 2 decades. A murder without a final answer. A cold case without the comfort of certainty. And a young woman whose story still ends with the same haunting silence that began it. Who killed Nona Dirksmeyer? The question does not disappear simply because the years become difficult to count. It remains attached to every unanswered detail, every disputed piece of evidence, every moment when the investigation seemed to move toward certainty only to stop again at the same invisible wall. And in Nona Dirksmeyer's case, that wall was built from doubt. Doubt about what happened inside the apartment. Doubt about who had been there. Doubt about what the physical evidence actually proved. Doubt about whether the investigation had followed every possibility with the same intensity. And above all, doubt about whether the person responsible had ever truly been identified. The case had already demonstrated how dangerous assumptions could become. Kevin Jones had once stood at the center of the investigation. His relationship with Nona made him an obvious person for investigators to examine. His behavior after her death became part of the prosecution's theory. Questions surrounding his statements became evidence in the minds of investigators. But suspicion had not been enough. A jury heard the case. A jury acquitted him. That verdict did not reveal who had killed Nona. It only established that the prosecution had not proved Jones was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Then the investigation turned. Gary Dunn became the new focus. And suddenly details that had once seemed peripheral acquired enormous importance. His proximity to Nona's apartment. His statements about his movements. Questions surrounding his alibi. Evidence connected to the apartment. the testimony of people who knew him. Everything was placed beneath the microscope. But a murder investigation is not a photograph. It is a reconstruction. Investigators take fragments of the past and attempt to build a sequence that explains a person's final moments. The difficulty is that fragments do not always fit together neatly. A piece of DNA can tell investigators that biological material is connected to someone. It cannot automatically tell them when it arrived. A witness can remember seeing someone. That does not necessarily prove what that person did afterward. A suspicious statement can raise questions. It does not automatically establish guilt. And an alibi can contain contradictions without proving murder. Those distinctions became critical in the Dirksmeyer investigation. Because the prosecution's theory had to survive every one of them. The first trial involving Dunn ended without a verdict. That alone was significant. A jury had heard the evidence. Jurors had listened to the arguments. They had considered the testimony. And they could not agree. The case did not end. Instead, it returned. A second trial followed. Again, the evidence was presented. Again, the defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation. Again, the state attempted to persuade a jury that Dunn was responsible for Nona's death. And again, certainty remained out of reach. Another jury deadlocked. Another mistrial. For a prosecution, that is more than a procedural setback. It is a warning. A warning that the evidence may not be telling a single unmistakable story. For Nona's family, however, there was no procedural distance. There was only the unbearable reality that years had passed and the person responsible had not been convicted. The legal system had produced hearings, trials, arguments, testimony, but no final resolution. And outside the courthouse, the public continued to ask the question that the courtroom could not answer. If Dunn was responsible, why could two juries not reach a unanimous guilty verdict? If Dunn was not responsible, then who was? And if Kevin Jones had been acquitted, what did that verdict mean for the investigation that followed? Those questions became part of the permanent shadow surrounding the case. The most unsettling aspect was that neither prosecution erased the other theory. The first trial did not produce the identity of the killer. The second investigation did not produce a conviction. Instead, the case became a collision between competing narratives. One narrative centered on the boyfriend. Another centered on the neighbor. And behind both narratives was a woman who could no longer speak. That is the cruel mathematics of a homicide investigation. The victim is the one person who knows exactly what happened. And the victim is the one person investigators can never question. Everything else is reconstruction. Every conclusion depends on evidence. Every theory depends on interpretation. Every prosecution depends on proof. When any one of those elements fails, the entire structure can collapse. That is what happened here. The case did not collapse because there was no evidence. It became difficult because the evidence could be interpreted in more than one way. That distinction matters. A murder can leave behind mountains of evidence and still remain unresolved. Investigators may know the approximate time of death. They may know the location. They may know how badly the victim was injured. They may identify people who were connected to the scene. They may recover biological evidence. They may establish relationships. They may reconstruct pieces of the victim's final hours. And yet the central question can remain unanswered. Who delivered the fatal attack? Who was physically present? Who knew what was happening? Who left the apartment afterward? Those are the questions that cannot be answered by assumptions. They require evidence. And evidence becomes increasingly complicated when years pass. Witnesses forget. People move. Relationships change. Memories become contaminated by conversations and media coverage. Physical evidence can deteriorate. Investigative records can become fragmented, and the original investigators may no longer be available to explain decisions they made decades earlier. The passage of time is not neutral. It changes the investigation itself. But time can also create opportunity. Modern forensic science is different from the science available in 2005. Databases expand. DNA analysis becomes more sensitive. Digital records become more extensive. Investigators can sometimes revisit evidence using techniques that did not exist when a crime first occurred. That possibility is one of the few reasons cold cases never truly die. A case can sit untouched for years and still contain evidence capable of answering questions. But technology cannot manufacture evidence that was never collected. It cannot recover every memory. It cannot reconstruct every missing minute. And it cannot guarantee that an old theory was correct. The Dirksmeyer case therefore remains a reminder that the first hours after a murder can be as important as the years that follow. When police first entered Nona's apartment, they did not know what the future would look like. They did not know there would be multiple suspects. They did not know there would be trials. They did not know juries would deadlock. They did not know the case would remain a source of public fascination for years. They were simply confronting a violent death. A 19-year-old woman was dying. A crime scene had to be secured. Evidence had to be collected. Statements had to be taken. And somewhere in that first chaotic period, the investigation had to begin separating fact from assumption. That is an almost impossible task. Because investigators are human. They are expected to form theories. A theory gives an investigation direction. But a theory can also become a trap. Once investigators believe they know who committed a crime, every new discovery risks being interpreted through that belief. Evidence that supports the theory feels significant. Evidence that contradicts it may be dismissed as irrelevant. This phenomenon is not unique to the Dirksmeyer case. It is a danger present in almost every complex investigation. And the longer a case continues, the harder it can become to step backward and ask the most uncomfortable question of all. What if the original assumption was wrong? What if the killer was never the person investigators first suspected? What if the most important clue was overlooked because it did not fit the story being constructed? What if the answer was hiding in plain sight? These questions have followed Nona's case for years. And they are especially difficult because the investigation has already produced multiple legal outcomes. One defendant was acquitted. Another faced 2 trials without a conviction. The law therefore left the case without the conclusion that the public expected. That does not mean there was no truth. There was a truth. There always was. Nona was killed. Someone caused that death. The truth exists somewhere between the last moment she was alive and the moment investigators arrived. The problem is finding it and proving it. That distinction separates a mystery from a criminal conviction. The public can believe. Investigators can suspect. Families can remember. But a courtroom requires proof. That is why the absence of a conviction should not be confused with the absence of evidence. The case contained evidence. The question was whether that evidence could establish guilt to the standard required by law. Twice juries said they could not reach that conclusion. That is the legal reality. And it leaves an extraordinary burden on anyone who revisits the case today. A new investigator cannot simply decide who looks most suspicious. A new theory must explain the old evidence. It must survive the old contradictions. It must account for the acquittal. It must confront the deadlocked juries. And it must produce something stronger than suspicion. Because Nona deserves more than another theory. Her family deserves more than another headline. And a murder investigation deserves more than a convenient ending. The danger in unresolved cases is the temptation to force an ending because uncertainty is uncomfortable. People want villains. They want motives. They want a final scene where handcuffs close and the mystery disappears. Real investigations rarely offer that kind of simplicity. Sometimes the truth is fragmented. Sometimes the evidence is incomplete. Sometimes investigators arrive at a conclusion that cannot be proven. And sometimes the only honest ending is to admit that the case remains unresolved. That is where Nona's story stands. Not because her death was insignificant. Not because investigators stopped caring. Not because the passage of time somehow made the crime less serious. But because the evidence has never produced the final certainty required to close the question of responsibility. And so the years continue. The name Nona Dirksmeyer remains attached to an old case file. The photographs remain. The transcripts remain. The testimony remains. The competing theories remain. And somewhere within those records may still be the detail that changes everything. A sentence. A timeline. A piece of forensic evidence. A witness memory. A contradiction. Something that was once considered unimportant. Something that investigators may have looked at without understanding what they were seeing. That is how cold cases sometimes move. Not through dramatic discoveries, but through tiny details. A detail that survives while everyone forgets the circumstances surrounding it. A detail that waits until someone asks a different question. And perhaps that is the most important question still surrounding Nona's death. Not simply who looks suspicious. Not simply whose story contained contradictions. But what evidence can independently establish who was responsible for the violence that ended Nona's life? That question is harder. It is slower. It does not make for an easy headline. But it is the question that matters. Because after more than 20 years, the case does not need another accusation. It needs an answer that can survive scrutiny. Until then, December 15, 2005 remains frozen in time. A young woman is alive. Then something happens. And moments later, she is fighting for her life. The emergency response begins. The investigation begins. The theories begin. And eventually the trials begin. But the final answer never arrives. The courtroom lights go out. The jurors leave. The attorneys return home. The investigators move on to other cases. The newspapers stop printing the story. The public finds another tragedy to discuss. But for Nona's family, there is no moving on in the ordinary sense. There is only learning how to live with a question that should never have existed. Who killed her? That question has survived every year. Every theory. Every courtroom. Every failed attempt at certainty. And until someone can finally answer it with evidence strong enough to withstand the law, the murder of Nona Dirksmeyer remains what it has always been. A crime without closure. A case without a final conviction. A young life ended before its future could begin. And a question still waiting in the darkness. The question remains because the evidence never managed to become a single story. It remained fragments, separate pieces, separate voices, separate interpretations. And every time investigators tried to assemble them into one picture, another crack appeared. For Nona's family, those cracks were not abstract legal arguments. They were years. Years measured in birthdays that came without her. Years measured in holidays where one chair remained empty. Years measured in photographs that never changed while everyone around them grew older. Nona remained 19 forever. The world continued without her. And the investigation continued without the one witness who mattered most. The night before her death may have seemed ordinary. There was no public warning that a tragedy was approaching.
No dramàtic annoncement.
No obvious sign that an ordinary day was about to become a permanent dividing line in the lives of everyone who knew her. That is how many murders began. Not with a scream. Not with a warning. With normality. A phone call. A conversation. a routine movement through a familiar place. Then suddenly normality disappears. The investigation that followed would eventually focus on people who had been connected to Nona's life and surroundings. But connection is not guilt. Proximity is not guilt. Suspicion is not guilt. That distinction became the central battlefield of the entire case. And nowhere was that more visible than in the courtroom. Trials are supposed to transform uncertainty into a verdict. Evidence is presented. Witnesses testify. Attorneys challenge one another. A judge explains the law. A jury listens. And eventually, 12 people are expected to decide whether the prosecution has proved its case. But what happens when they cannot agree? The answer is unsettling. Nothing is resolved. That is precisely what happened in Dunn's trials. The prosecution presented its theory. The defense challenged it. The jurors considered the evidence. And both times the case stopped at the same point. No unanimous verdict. No conviction. No definitive declaration that Gary Dunn was responsible for Nona's death. The legal system could not cross the final distance between suspicion and proof. That does not automatically establish innocence. But neither does it establish guilt. It leaves a space. And that space has defined the case for years. The public often wants that space filled. Humans dislike unfinished stories. We want causes. We want explanations. We want someone to blame. When a young woman is murdered, uncertainty feels almost intolerable. There is an instinct to take the available pieces and create a complete picture. But the law is deliberately more cautious. It demands proof. And that requirement exists for a reason. Because once a person is convicted of murder, the consequences cannot be undone simply because investigators later discover they were wrong. The Dirksmeyer investigation therefore became a complicated lesson in the difference between what seems possible and what can actually be proved. Consider the DNA evidence. To the public, the word DNA can sound almost magical. DNA appears. Identity appears. Mystery solved. Real forensic science is not that simple. DNA can establish biological association. But investigators must still determine how the biological material arrived at a location. When it arrived. Under what circumstances. And whether it has any direct connection to the crime itself. In Nona's case, evidence associated with Dunn became a major part of the prosecution's theory. But the defense had another interpretation. That interpretation mattered because jurors were not being asked whether Dunn had ever been connected to Nona's apartment. They were being asked whether the state had proved that he murdered her. Those are very different questions. And the difference between them can be the difference between suspicion and conviction. The same principle applied to the alibi evidence. An inconsistent story can be suspicious. But suspicion must still lead somewhere. Investigators must establish what actually happened. If someone says they were somewhere and later details change, that can raise questions. But it does not automatically answer the question of murder. The prosecution must connect the contradiction to the crime. It must explain the significance. It must demonstrate why the evidence points toward one person and away from every reasonable alternative. That is an enormous burden. Especially when another person has already been tried and acquitted. The defense could use that history to create reasonable doubt. The prosecution could argue that the acquittal did not prove who the actual killer was. Both positions could exist at the same time. And that is what made the case so difficult. One jury had rejected the prosecution's case against Jones. Two later juries could not agree on Dunn. The result was not a clean chain of events. It was a series of unanswered questions. And every unanswered question created another. If Jones was not the killer, who was? If Dunn was the killer, why did the evidence fail to convince two juries? If the evidence pointed toward Dunn, was there additional evidence that had not been found? If the evidence was insufficient, what crucial piece was missing? And if that missing piece still exists somewhere, where is it? These questions become more haunting with time because the physical world keeps changing. People die. Buildings are demolished. Objects disappear. Records become harder to locate. Memories fade. A witness who once remembered a face clearly may struggle to reconstruct it decades later. And yet the passage of time can sometimes have the opposite effect. A person may suddenly remember something they once dismissed. A former witness may reconsider a conversation. A family member may discover an old photograph. An investigator may revisit an old report and notice an inconsistency that no one previously recognized. That is why unresolved homicide investigations remain open in the minds of investigators, even after the headlines disappear. The case file may become old. The questions do not. And Nona's case has plenty of questions. One of the most disturbing is how quickly the investigation became focused on specific individuals. That focus may have been understandable. Investigators naturally look first at people closest to a victim. Partners. Friends. Neighbors. People with access. People whose stories can be tested. That is standard investigative logic. But standard logic can create blind spots. If investigators focus too narrowly, another possibility may receive less attention. If the first suspect becomes the center of the investigation, every subsequent discovery can be interpreted through that lens. And when that suspect is eventually cleared or acquitted, investigators must force themselves to begin again. Starting over is difficult. It means questioning earlier assumptions. It means admitting that something may have been missed. It means returning to evidence that investigators once believed they understood. And it means accepting that the person who appeared most suspicious may not have been the person responsible. The Dirksmeyer case demonstrates exactly how dangerous certainty can become when certainty arrives before proof. Yet there is another side to the story. Investigators were not operating with perfect information. They were dealing with a violent death. They had limited time. They had incomplete knowledge. They had witnesses whose memories were imperfect. They had evidence that required interpretation. And they had a community demanding answers. The pressure was enormous. A young woman had been murdered. Someone had to be held responsible. But justice cannot simply be manufactured because a community is desperate for closure. That is the uncomfortable truth. Closure and justice are not always the same thing. A conviction can provide closure. But a wrongful conviction is not justice. An acquittal can protect an innocent person. But it does not tell a grieving family who actually committed the crime. A mistrial can be legally correct. But emotionally it can feel like another door closing. For Nona's family, every courtroom ending must have carried that contradiction. The case had moved. The legal system had acted. But the fundamental question remained. Who killed her? More than 20 years later, that question still defines the story. And perhaps the most chilling aspect is how ordinary the surrounding world can become. People drive past familiar streets. Businesses open. Children grow up. New families move into neighborhoods. Most people do not know the history beneath their feet. They do not know where the headlines once gathered. They do not know that decades earlier, investigators were examining blood-stained evidence and asking whether a killer had walked away unnoticed. Time creates distance. But distance is not erasure. For those who remember Nona, the case is not an old documentary. It is personal history. It is the memory of a person who should have had decades more life. Nona should have turned 20. Then 21. Then 22. She should have experienced ordinary disappointments and ordinary victories. She should have changed. Her interests should have evolved. Her voice should have matured. Her future should have become something nobody could predict. Instead, her image remains frozen at 19. That is what murder steals beyond life itself. It steals every future version of a person. And when the crime remains unresolved, even the narrative of that person's final moments becomes uncertain. People can debate what happened. They can debate who was responsible. They can debate evidence. But nobody can ask Nona. That is why every unresolved case carries an almost unbearable silence. The victim is absent from every argument. And yet everything depends upon reconstructing her final hours. There is another question that has haunted cold cases for generations. What if the killer believed the investigation would never identify them? That possibility is what makes old cases so unsettling. A person can live for decades believing they escaped justice. They can build a career, have a family, move to another city, change their appearance, change their name, or simply continue living while everyone else slowly forgets. But evidence can survive. A fingerprint can survive. A DNA profile can survive. A photograph can survive. A forgotten record can survive. Sometimes the smallest physical trace can outlive the person who left it. And that is why the passage of 20 years does not necessarily mean the end. It can mean the beginning of a different kind of investigation. A modern investigation. One built not only on witness recollections and traditional forensic methods, but on databases, digital records, advanced DNA analysis, and the ability to revisit evidence with technologies unavailable in 2005. But before any technology can solve a cold case, investigators must know what they are looking for. They must understand the original investigation. They must identify what was tested, what was not tested, what was lost, what remains, what conclusions were drawn, and which conclusions were assumptions rather than facts. That process can be uncomfortable, because reopening an old case can reveal mistakes. It can reveal gaps. It can reveal evidence that was not preserved as carefully as it should have been. But that discomfort is necessary. A cold case cannot be solved by protecting the old investigation from criticism. It can only be solved by questioning it. Every assumption must be challenged. Every timeline must be reconstructed. Every piece of evidence must be examined in context. And every suspect must be considered according to evidence, not reputation. That is the standard Nona's case still demands. Not a sensational answer. A defensible one. Because after more than 2 decades, the easiest thing would be to choose a suspect and declare the mystery solved. The harder thing is to admit that the evidence may still be incomplete. The harder thing is to keep asking questions. The harder thing is to continue searching when the public has moved on. That is what a true cold case investigation requires. Persistence. Patience. And the willingness to say, after all these years, that the answer is still unknown. Nona Dirksmeyer was not a headline. She was a 19-year-old woman. She had a family, friends, dreams. A life that was supposed to continue. Instead, her death created a question that has lasted for more than 20 years. The people who investigated it eventually changed. The attorneys changed. The juries changed. The theories changed. But Nona's absence did not. And somewhere in the distance between the first police response and the last courtroom proceeding lies the truth. It has always been there. The challenge is finding it. And until that truth is finally established beyond reasonable doubt, the case remains suspended in the same terrible place. Not solved. Not forgotten. Not closed. Waiting. Waiting for the one detail that can change a theory into proof. Waiting for the one piece of evidence that can turn uncertainty into certainty. Waiting for the moment when an old name in an old case file suddenly becomes more than a name. Because cold cases do not always remain cold because there is no evidence. Sometimes they remain cold because the evidence refuses to speak clearly. That distinction matters. In the murder of Nona Dirksmeyer, investigators were never dealing with a complete absence of clues. They were dealing with too many competing interpretations. Each new discovery seemed to answer one question while creating another. The apartment had become the center of the investigation. Inside those walls, Nona's final moments had unfolded. Every object could potentially carry significance. Every surface could contain information. Every movement through the apartment could become part of a timeline. But a crime scene does not explain itself. Investigators have to interpret it. An interpretation is where uncertainty begins. The scene could tell investigators that violence had occurred. It could show where blood had been found. It could reveal signs of a struggle. It could provide biological evidence. But the scene could not simply point toward one person and say, "This is the killer." That conclusion had to be built, piece by piece. And every piece had to withstand challenge. That was the problem. The case contained pieces, but the complete picture remained elusive. When Kevin Jones was first accused, the prosecution had attempted to construct that picture around him. His relationship with Nona became important. His behavior became important. His statements became important. His presence after the discovery became important. Investigators looked at his actions through the possibility that he had committed the crime. But the courtroom ultimately rejected the prosecution's case. The acquittal changed the landscape. Suddenly, investigators had to look elsewhere. And that is where Gary Dunn entered the center of the story. Dunn's proximity to Nona's apartment became significant. So did the questions surrounding his alibi. And then there was the forensic evidence. The discovery of DNA associated with Dunn on a condom wrapper recovered from the apartment became one of the most discussed elements of the prosecution's case. To understand why that evidence mattered, it is necessary to understand what it did not automatically prove. It did not provide a video recording of the murder. It did not establish the exact moment the DNA had been deposited. It did not independently reconstruct the entire crime. It was evidence. Important evidence. But evidence that still required context. The prosecution argued that context pointed toward Dunn. The defense argued that the same evidence could be interpreted differently. That disagreement became the heart of the courtroom battle. Because in a murder trial, evidence does not exist in isolation. A prosecutor can place 10 pieces of evidence on a table. The defense can challenge every one. The jury then has to decide whether those pieces form a chain strong enough to establish guilt. If even one major link remains uncertain, reasonable doubt can enter. And reasonable doubt can stop a conviction. That is what happened. Not once. Twice. The juries did not provide the ending the prosecution sought. And that fact became part of the history of the case. Years later, people could still argue about what the evidence meant. But they could not change the courtroom record. There had been no conviction. There had been no final judicial determination that Gary Dunn was Nona's killer. That distinction is essential. The phrase "the killer" sounds definitive. The legal record was not definitive. And a responsible account of Nona's death must preserve that difference. There is another reason the case remains so compelling. It exposes the enormous gap between knowing something happened and proving who caused it. Everyone knew Nona had died violently. There was no mystery about the tragedy itself. The mystery was responsibility. Who caused the fatal injuries? Who was present? Who had the opportunity? Who had a reason? And most importantly, what evidence could establish those answers beyond reasonable doubt? Those questions are far more difficult than they appear. Opportunity can be shared. Motives can be hidden. Alibis can be incomplete. Witnesses can misunderstand what they saw. And forensic evidence can be powerful without being conclusive. That is why homicide investigations are rarely solved by one clue. They are solved by convergence. Independent evidence points in the same direction. The timeline fits. The physical evidence fits. The witness testimony fits. The suspect's behavior fits. The motive makes sense. And alternative explanations collapse. In Nona's case, that convergence never became strong enough to produce a conviction. Something was always missing. Something remained disputed. Something left room for doubt. And that missing element may be the most important clue of all. Because if investigators can identify what prevented the evidence from becoming conclusive, they may discover where the investigation still needs to go. Was there evidence that was never tested? Was something collected but never properly analyzed? Was a witness overlooked? Was a timeline misunderstood? Was an assumption accepted too early? Or was the truth simply too complicated to reconstruct after the passage of time? These are not questions with easy answers. But cold cases demand difficult questions. The public often imagines a cold case as a locked box. Inside the box is a single secret. Open it and everything becomes clear. Real cases are different. They are more like thousands of scattered pieces. Some belong to the crime. Some belong to ordinary life. Some are misleading. Some are incomplete. Some are connected to innocent explanations. And the investigator's job is to determine which is which. That requires discipline. Because the wrong conclusion can be just as dangerous as no conclusion. An innocent person can become permanently associated with a murder they did not commit. A guilty person can remain free. And a victim's family can be forced to live between those two possibilities. That is why the burden of proof matters so much. Protects the accused. But it also protects the integrity of the investigation. A conviction built on uncertainty does not provide true closure. It creates another injustice. And Nona's case already contains the painful history of an acquittal and 2 mistrials. The lesson is unavoidable. Suspicion must be tested. Evidence must be tested. Theories must be tested. Again. And again. And again. Until the facts either support the theory or destroy it. That is what makes the passage of time both an enemy and a potential ally. Time destroys memories. But time can also reveal inconsistencies. Time can make people speak differently. Time can bring new forensic technology. Time can change the way investigators interpret old evidence. And time can make it possible to revisit a case without the assumptions that dominated the original investigation. Imagine opening the case file today. The photographs are old. The reports are old. The testimony is old. The names are familiar. But the questions can be new. What would a modern investigator notice? What would modern forensic analysis reveal? Could old biological evidence be examined with techniques unavailable 2 decades ago? Could previously unknown genetic associations become relevant? Could digital records reconstruct movements that investigators in 2005 could only estimate? Could old witness statements be compared against records that did not exist at the time? These possibilities do not solve the case by themselves. But they explain why a cold case can never truly be considered dead. Evidence can wait. And sometimes the technology needed to understand it simply has not been invented yet. That possibility gives Nona's case a strange quality. The past may still contain something capable of changing the future. A tiny trace. A forgotten object. A preserved sample. A statement buried in an old transcript. A detail that never received the attention it deserved. The problem is knowing where to look. And that is where investigators face another obstacle. There is no guarantee that the most important clue will look important. Criminal investigations are full of ordinary details. Time. a location, a phone call, a receipt, a conversation, a vehicle, piece of clothing, a person's routine. Individually, these things may appear meaningless. Together, they can create a timeline. And timelines can destroy lies. A suspect can say they were somewhere. A record can show otherwise. A witness can remember a meeting. A phone record can place someone somewhere else. A forensic result can establish contact. A surveillance image can confirm movement. Each independent fact reduces uncertainty. The challenge in a case as old as Nona's is reconstructing those facts accurately. 2 decades create gaps. And gaps create doubt. But doubt does not mean the truth is unknowable. It means the investigation must work harder. That is why the case remains a test of persistence. Not the persistence of headlines. Not the persistence of public speculation. The persistence of evidence. The evidence has to lead. Not the theory. Not the emotion. Not the desire for a dramatic ending. The evidence. Because Nona deserves an answer that cannot be easily challenged. Her family deserves an answer that does not collapse under cross-examination. And the person responsible, whoever that person is, must be identified through facts rather than assumption. That is the only ending worthy of the case. Until then, every conclusion remains incomplete. Every theory remains a theory. Every suspect remains a suspect unless the evidence establishes more. And every year that passes makes the question more haunting. How can a murder remain unresolved for so long? The answer is uncomfortable. Because solving a murder is not simply about finding someone who appears suspicious. It is about proving what happened. It is about establishing sequence. It is about eliminating reasonable alternatives. It is about building a case strong enough to survive the most aggressive challenge. And sometimes, despite years of investigation, that final bridge cannot be crossed. Nona's case reached that point. The investigation crossed one bridge. Then another. But the final bridge remained. And on the other side of that bridge was the only thing everyone wanted. The truth. Not the most convincing theory. Not the most frightening possibility. Not the suspect whose name appears most often in old headlines. The truth. Somewhere in the surviving evidence, the truth about Nona's final hours may still exist. Perhaps it is already known but cannot yet be proven. Perhaps it lies in evidence that has never been fully understood. Perhaps it is contained in a memory someone has carried silently for decades. Or perhaps the crucial piece is gone forever. That is the uncertainty that makes the case so haunting. There is no guarantee that the missing answer will ever appear. But there is also no guarantee that it will not. And as long as evidence remains, the possibility remains. The possibility that one day an investigator will look at an old fact and see something completely different. The possibility that one test will produce a result. The possibility that one witness will finally speak. The possibility that one forgotten detail will connect 2 pieces that have spent 20 years apart. That possibility is enough to keep the question alive. Who killed Nona Dirksmeyer? The answer has survived more than 2 decades without being proven. And that means the story is not really about the past. It is about the space between what we think we know and what can actually be established. It is about the danger of certainty without proof. It is about the fragility of memory. It is about the power of forensic evidence. And it is about a young woman whose life ended in an apartment in Arkansas, while the world around her continued moving. The headlines eventually faded. The courtroom arguments became history. The suspects became older. The investigators moved on. But Nona remained 19. And her family remained with the question. 20 years. 20 years of birthdays. 20 years of unanswered calls. 20 years of theories. 20 years of wondering whether the person responsible was identified, whether they were overlooked, or whether the decisive evidence is still somewhere waiting to be found. That is what a cold case really is. Not a story that ended. A story that stopped. And there is a difference. An ending means the truth has been established. A stopped story means the truth may still be somewhere ahead. For Nona Dirksmeyer, the story stopped on a December day in 2005. But the question never stopped. It followed the investigators. It followed the defendants. It followed the attorneys. It followed the families. And it followed every person who opened the case file and wondered whether the answer was closer than anyone realized. The years may continue. Another decade may pass. The photographs may become older. The names may become less familiar to the public. But the evidence remains part of the record. And as long as that record exists, there is still one thing that cannot be erased. The possibility of an answer. Somewhere beneath the old reports and disputed testimony, beneath the forensic evidence and competing theories, beneath the courtroom arguments and the unanswered questions, the truth about what happened to Nona Dirksmeyer remains. Waiting. Silent. Unfinished. And until that silence is finally broken by evidence strong enough to withstand the law, her murder remains one of those cases that refuses to disappear. Not because people want another mystery. Because someone somewhere still deserves the truth. The truth does not become less important because the case becomes old. If anything, time makes the question heavier. Every year added to the calendar is another year without a final answer. Another year in which the people who knew Nona must live with the possibility that the person responsible was never held accountable. And yet there is something else that time does. It strips away the noise. The headlines disappear. The television cameras disappear. The courtroom arguments become transcripts. What remains are the facts. Nona was 19. She was found gravely injured inside her Russellville apartment. She died after the attack. An investigation followed. Kevin Jones was accused and prosecuted. He was acquitted. Later, Gary Dunn became the focus of the investigation. He was prosecuted twice. Neither trial produced a conviction. And after all those years, the fundamental question remained unanswered. Who killed Nona? That question sounds simple. The evidence is not. Every murder investigation eventually becomes an attempt to reconstruct a sequence of events. Someone was alive. Then something happened. Then that person was dead. Between those 2 points is the entire mystery. Investigators must determine what happened in the missing space. Who entered? Who spoke? Who moved? Who attacked? Who left? What did the victim know? What did the offender know? And what evidence survived the event? In Nona's case, investigators had to reconstruct those missing moments without the benefit of a surviving eyewitness who could describe them. That meant the physical evidence became enormously important. But physical evidence has limitations. Blood can tell investigators about injury and movement. DNA can associate a person with biological material. Fingerprints can establish contact. Objects can reveal activity. But none of these things automatically provides motive. None automatically reveals intent. And none automatically proves who committed a fatal act. Context is everything. That is why the courtroom became so important. A piece of evidence that appears powerful outside a courtroom can become much more complicated when subjected to cross-examination. How was it collected? When was it collected? Who handled it? Could it have arrived there innocently? Is there another explanation? Does it prove the crime or merely establish contact? Those questions can transform the meaning of evidence. And the defense has every right to ask them. That process can frustrate the public. People watching from outside the courtroom may think, how can anyone doubt this? But jurors are not asked whether something feels suspicious. They are asked whether the prosecution has proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard is intentionally high. It must be, because the consequences are permanent. In Nona's case, the prosecution did not cross that threshold against Jones. Then it could not cross it against Dunn. The legal system therefore left behind a strange paradox. There was a murder. There were suspects. There was evidence. There were trials. And yet there was no final conviction. That is not the ending people expect from a murder story. But real life does not always provide the ending people expect. Sometimes a case reaches the courtroom and comes back unresolved. Sometimes the evidence is compelling but incomplete. Sometimes two sides present plausible interpretations of the same events. And sometimes the jury is left exactly where investigators were years earlier. Uncertain. That uncertainty is difficult to live with. Especially for a family. Because families do not experience a murder as a legal question. They experience it as an absence. The empty chair. The unanswered phone. The photograph on the wall. The memories that become more precious as time passes. The realization that someone who should have grown older never had the opportunity. Nona should have been 40 years old by 2026. Instead, every public photograph still shows the 19-year-old woman she was when her life ended. That contrast is brutal. The world moves forward. The victim cannot. And the family must somehow move forward while carrying a past that never received a proper conclusion. That is one of the cruelest realities of unresolved homicide cases. Closure is often treated as something inevitable. But closure is not guaranteed. Sometimes families receive justice. Sometimes they receive answers. Sometimes they receive both. And sometimes they receive neither. The Dirksmeyer case belongs to that final category. It is a story about an investigation that generated enormous attention, but never produced the definitive courtroom answer everyone wanted. And that makes every surviving detail more important. The details surrounding Nona's final day. The people who saw her. The people who spoke with her. The people who were near her. The timeline. The evidence. The statements. The inconsistencies. Every detail matters because there is no single piece that has ended the debate. That is why revisiting the case requires restraint. It is tempting to connect every suspicious detail. But not every suspicious detail is connected. It is tempting to treat every contradiction as proof. But contradictions can have innocent explanations. It is tempting to interpret every forensic association as a smoking gun. But forensic evidence must be understood within its circumstances. And it is tempting to decide that because someone was accused, they must have done something wrong. That is precisely the kind of assumption that can destroy an investigation. A cold case should not be solved by storytelling. It should be solved by evidence. That distinction is especially important when a case has already produced conflicting legal outcomes. The acquittal of Kevin Jones means that the state failed to prove he was Nona's killer. The mistrials involving Gary Dunn mean that juries could not unanimously determine his guilt. These are not minor details. They are central facts. Any future investigation must confront them. A new theory cannot simply pretend the previous theories never existed. It must explain why earlier prosecutions failed. It must explain the evidence that supported competing interpretations. And it must produce something stronger. Something independent. Something capable of eliminating reasonable doubt. That is the standard required for a true resolution. And perhaps that is why cold cases sometimes take decades. The first investigation may discover the obvious. The second may discover what was hidden. The third may finally understand what the first two could not. Investigations evolve. Science evolves. Technology evolves. People evolve. But evidence does not change its history. The challenge is learning how to read it. Imagine an investigator opening the file today. They see the same names, the same dates, the same photographs, the same testimony, but they have tools that investigators in 2005 did not have. They can approach the case without necessarily accepting the original assumptions. They can ask different questions. They can compare old evidence against modern databases. They can analyze timelines with digital records. They can revisit biological material. They can examine old forensic conclusions. They can search for connections that were impossible to see 2 decades earlier. None of that guarantees a solution. But it creates possibility. And possibility is the reason cold case detectives continue opening old files. Because somewhere among thousands of pages may be one line that matters. Somewhere among hundreds of photographs may be one object that was overlooked. Somewhere in a forgotten evidence box may be a sample that can now be tested. Somewhere in a witness statement may be a detail that never received enough attention. And somewhere in the memories of people who knew Nona may be information that has never been shared. The problem is that time also creates another danger. False memory. People can become convinced they remember something that was actually learned from television, newspapers, conversations, or repeated speculation. The more a story is discussed, the more difficult it can become to separate original memory from later information. That is why investigators must be cautious with decades-old recollections. A memory can be sincere and still be wrong. A witness can honestly believe something happened without having remembered it accurately. Again, the answer is evidence. Independent evidence. Evidence that does not depend entirely on someone's memory. That principle returns again and again. Evidence. Not assumption. Evidence. Not rumor. Evidence. Not headlines. The case has survived because the evidence was significant enough to produce prosecutions. But it has remained unresolved because the evidence was not sufficient to produce a final conviction. That contradiction is the heart of the mystery. It is also the reason the case continues to attract attention. People want to understand how a murder can generate so much evidence and still remain unanswered. The answer is that evidence has degrees of certainty. A clue can be important without being conclusive. A suspect can be plausible without being proven guilty. A theory can explain many facts while leaving one critical fact unexplained. And sometimes that one unexplained fact is enough to prevent a conviction. In a courtroom, reasonable doubt can exist inside a single missing link. That missing link can outweigh an entire collection of suspicious circumstances. That is not a flaw. It is a safeguard. But safeguards do not comfort grieving families. For them, the question remains personal. Who did this? Why? Why Nona? Why did her life have to end? Why has the answer remained out of reach? Those questions have no easy response. A murderer does not always leave behind a clear motive. Sometimes investigators understand the how but not the why. Sometimes they understand opportunity but cannot establish identity. Sometimes they can identify a person connected to evidence but cannot prove the circumstances. The Dirksmeyer case has lived in that space for years. Between suspicion and certainty. Between evidence and proof. Between memory and fact. Between justice and closure. That space is where cold cases survive. And it can be enormous. Because while a courtroom may close, a family does not. A trial may end. A mistrial may be declared. A defendant may walk out of court. But the family still goes home with the same photograph. The same memories. The same unanswered question. And perhaps the most painful part is knowing that the person responsible may know exactly what happened. If the killer is alive, They may have carried that knowledge for more than 20 years. They may have watched the trials. They may have heard the accusations. They may have watched the public debate. They may know which evidence investigators discovered. They may know which evidence investigators never found. That possibility is deeply unsettling, because it means the person who knows the truth may not be the person telling it. And a confession cannot be forced into existence. It must come voluntarily, or the evidence must eventually speak for itself. That is why investigators cannot depend on confession. They depend on proof. A confession can be powerful, but evidence must corroborate it. Otherwise, even a confession can become another mystery. Cold case investigators understand this. They do not simply want someone to say, "I did it." They need to establish whether that statement is true. Where? When? How? Why? What evidence supports it? What details could only the perpetrator know? Every answer creates another test. That is how an unresolved murder becomes solvable. Not through one dramatic moment. Through convergence. And perhaps Nona's case is still waiting for that convergence. The evidence already known. The evidence yet to be discovered. The technology not yet applied. The witness not yet heard. The connection not yet recognized. All of it waiting for the right combination. Until then, the case remains suspended. The calendar keeps moving. 2026 arrives. The world has changed almost beyond recognition since 2005. Phones are different. Cameras are everywhere. Digital footprints are enormous. Forensic laboratories can do things investigators could only dream about 20 years ago. Yet the central question remains exactly the same. Who killed Nona Dirksmeyer? That question is older now. But it is not weaker. Because every year that passes only makes the contrast sharper. Nona was 19. More than 20 years later, the person responsible has had more than 2 decades to live with the truth. More than 2 decades to remember. More than 2 decades to remain silent. And more than 2 decades for the evidence to wait. Perhaps the answer is still hidden. Perhaps it has already been examined and misunderstood. Perhaps it is sitting in a file that someone has not opened in years. Perhaps it is connected to a person no one considered important. Or perhaps the truth will never be known. That is the fear at the heart of every cold case. Not that the answer is difficult, but that the answer may disappear before anyone finds it. And yet there is one thing time cannot erase. Nona existed. She lived. She was loved. She had a future. That future was taken from her. Whatever happens to the investigation, that fact remains. Her life was more than the crime committed against her. She was more than a photograph. More than a headline. More than a name in a courtroom. And if the case is ever solved, the final answer will not simply identify a suspect. It will restore a piece of the truth surrounding the person Nona was. It will explain what happened. It will finally give her family something that has been missing for decades. An ending. Until then, there is only the question. The same question investigators faced when the case began. The same question jurors carried into deliberations. The same question that survived an acquittal. The same question that survived 2 mistrials. The same question that survived 20 years. Who killed Nona Dirksmeyer? And somewhere beyond the old headlines, beyond the courtroom arguments, beyond the theories that have risen and fallen, that answer may still be waiting. Waiting for evidence. Waiting for science. Waiting for memory. Waiting for someone to look again. Because sometimes the truth does not disappear. Sometimes it simply remains hidden until someone is willing to search for it one more time. There is a strange moment in every cold case when the noise finally dies. The reporters leave. The courthouse empties. The investigators stop making daily calls. The evidence is cataloged. The names disappear from television screens. And what remains is a file. A box. A photograph. A collection of statements from people who, at the time, could not have known that their words would still matter decades later. For Nona Dirksmeyer, that silence arrived long ago. But silence is not the same thing as resolution. A case can disappear from public attention without disappearing from the record. The facts remain. The arguments remain. The contradictions remain. And sometimes the smallest contradiction becomes more important with every passing year. Because when a case remains unresolved, investigators cannot afford to treat uncertainty as an inconvenience. Uncertainty is evidence that something is missing. It may be a missing person, a missing timeline, a missing forensic connection, a missing explanation, or simply a missing piece of information that would allow two known facts to finally connect. That is the challenge presented by Nona's murder. There are known facts. There are disputed facts. There are interpretations. And somewhere between them lies a sequence that happened only once. Nona's final hours. They cannot be repeated. The witnesses cannot travel back in time. The apartment cannot be returned to the exact condition in which investigators found it. The people involved cannot be placed back into the positions they occupied that day. A murder is a moment that happens once. An investigation attempts to recreate it thousands of times. That is why every investigation depends so heavily on the first response. The first officer. The first photograph. The first evidence bag. The first interview. The first timeline. The first theory. Every decision can become part of the permanent record. And once a theory becomes established, it can influence everything that follows. That is one of the most difficult lessons in criminal investigation. The human mind naturally searches for patterns. Give someone enough facts and they will try to connect them. Investigators are not immune. They have to build theories to solve crimes. But they also have to destroy their own theories. That is the difference between an investigation and a conclusion. A conclusion says, we know. An investigation says, show me. Show me the evidence. Show me the timeline. Show me the connection. Show me what happened. And if the evidence contradicts the theory, change the theory. That principle became especially important after the prosecution of Kevin Jones failed. An acquittal does not identify the killer. But it does force investigators to confront a difficult possibility. What if the original theory was wrong? That question can be psychologically difficult. Years of work may have been invested in one suspect. Evidence may have been interpreted through that suspect. Investigators may have publicly defended their conclusions. Then the jury says no. Suddenly, the investigation must look in another direction. The case involving Gary Dunn represented that shift. But the second theory also encountered resistance. The evidence could not produce a unanimous verdict. And when that happened twice, the case entered an unusual legal and investigative space. There was no clean transition from one suspect to another. There was no final conviction. There was no courtroom moment in which everyone could say the mystery had ended. Instead, the investigation became a collection of competing possibilities. And that is where it remained. The danger of competing possibilities is that each can become a substitute for truth. One person believes Jones was responsible. Another believes Dunn was responsible. Someone else believes the real killer was never seriously investigated. Another person believes the available evidence is simply insufficient to know. Each theory may sound convincing depending on which facts are emphasized. But the purpose of an investigation is not to find the theory that sounds best. It is to find the theory that survives every reasonable challenge. That is much harder. And perhaps that is why Nona's case continues to resist a final answer. The evidence does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside a history that includes an acquittal, 2 mistrials, disputed forensic interpretations, questions about timelines, questions about witness accounts, questions about the original investigative direction. Every future investigator must walk through that history carefully. Ignoring it would be dangerous. Accepting every conclusion from it would be equally dangerous. The only safe approach is to return to the evidence. Start again. What do we actually know? What do we only believe? What can be independently verified? What depends on someone's memory? What depends on someone's interpretation? What can be scientifically tested? What cannot? And perhaps the most important question: what remains unexplained? Unexplained details are often where cold cases breathe. They are the spaces where a new investigation can enter. An unexplained phone call, an unexplained movement, an unexplained biological trace, an unexplained statement, a person whose presence was never adequately accounted for. Any of these could become important, but only if someone looks. And that is the problem with old cases. Someone has to decide to look again. Cold case investigators are often described as detectives who reopen old mysteries. But their real task is more difficult. They must reopen old assumptions. They must examine what earlier investigators believed they already knew. They must ask whether the original interpretation still survives modern scrutiny. They must be willing to say, "We may have been wrong." That sentence is difficult, but it can be the beginning of progress. Modern forensic science has made that kind of re-examination increasingly valuable. DNA testing can sometimes produce information from samples that once appeared unusable. Genetic databases can create connections that did not exist when evidence was first collected. Digital records can reconstruct movements. Old photographs can be enhanced. Documents can be compared electronically. Timelines can be reconstructed with extraordinary precision. None of these tools guarantees justice, but they create new opportunities. And in an old homicide case, opportunity matters. Because the evidence does not need to be completely new. Sometimes old evidence becomes new evidence when science changes. A sample collected in 2005 can be analyzed differently years later. A photograph can reveal something investigators did not notice. A record can be cross-referenced against a database that did not exist. A witness statement can be compared against objective information that was unavailable at the time. That is how the past can suddenly become relevant to the present. And Nona's case is exactly the kind of case in which such possibilities matter. Because there has already been extensive investigation. The basic facts have been examined. The major suspects have been identified. The courtroom has heard the arguments. The question now is not simply whether there was enough evidence to prosecute. There was. The question is whether there is enough evidence to finally establish what happened. That is a different standard. And it may require looking beyond the most obvious suspects. One of the greatest mistakes in cold case investigations is assuming that everyone important was identified during the original investigation. Sometimes they were not. Sometimes a person was interviewed once and forgotten. Sometimes a witness was considered unreliable and never revisited. Sometimes a person who seemed irrelevant at the time becomes significant years later. Sometimes investigators simply did not know what questions to ask. The passage of time can change that. New investigators may not carry the same assumptions. They may approach the case differently. They may notice details that previous investigators considered ordinary. And they may recognize connections that were invisible 20 years earlier. But there is also a painful reality. Some evidence cannot be recovered. Some memories cannot be restored. Some witnesses will never speak again. Some people who knew the truth may have died. Some physical evidence may have been lost. And some questions may now be impossible to answer. That is why the first investigation matters so much. The opportunity to collect evidence is often temporary. The opportunity to interpret it can last decades. But if the evidence itself disappears, no amount of modern technology can bring it back. This is the tragedy behind many cold cases. The truth may have been available once. But the right question was not asked. The right test was not performed. The right connection was not made. And now the opportunity may be gone. Still, that does not mean investigators should stop. Because nobody can know which piece is missing until the entire picture has been reconsidered. That is why the case of Nona Dirksmeyer remains more than a historical murder. It remains an investigative challenge. A test of evidence. A test of memory. A test of forensic science. And a test of whether the passage of time can be overcome. The public may remember the case because of the mystery. Investigators should remember it because of the unanswered evidence. Those are two different things. Mystery creates attention. Evidence creates answers. And after more than 20 years, the only thing that can finally end the story is evidence. Not another headline. Not another accusation. Not another theory. Evidence. Something capable of surviving courtroom scrutiny. Something capable of explaining the crime without leaving a reasonable alternative. Something capable of connecting the person responsible to the violence that ended Nona's life. That is what has been missing. And until it appears, every conclusion must remain cautious. Because the greatest danger in a case like this is not admitting that the answer is unknown. The greatest danger is pretending that the answer is known when it is not. That danger is especially serious when a human life is involved. Nona was not a puzzle. She was not a mystery designed for entertainment. She was a person. Her death was real. Her family suffered real loss. The investigation had real consequences. And every suspect named in connection with her death is a real person whose life has also been permanently altered by the case. That is why the story cannot simply be reduced to who did it. There is another question. What would justice actually look like? Would it be a conviction? A confession? A definitive forensic finding? A complete reconstruction? Perhaps it would be all of those things. But above everything else, justice would mean truth. Knowing what happened to Nona. Knowing who was responsible. Knowing how the evidence fits. Knowing that the answer was not manufactured simply to satisfy the public. That kind of truth takes time. Sometimes decades. And sometimes it never arrives. But as long as the possibility remains, the case cannot truly be forgotten. Because somewhere, there may still be someone who knows something. Someone who was young in 2005 and is older now. Someone who remembers a conversation differently. Someone who once dismissed a detail that now seems important. Someone who has carried a secret for 20 years. Cold cases can be changed by technology. But they can also be changed by people. A witness can decide to speak. A former friend can come forward. A family member can discover an old document. A person who was afraid can finally feel safe enough to tell investigators what they know. There is no guarantee. But there is possibility. And possibility is enough to keep the investigation alive. The calendar has moved far beyond the year when Nona died. The technology surrounding criminal investigation has transformed. The people who once dominated the headlines have grown older. Yet the central question remains untouched. Who killed Nona Dirksmeyer? It is the same question. But perhaps the answer is closer now than it was 20 years ago. Perhaps modern science will reveal something. Perhaps a forgotten witness will speak. Perhaps an old assumption will finally be challenged. Perhaps the evidence has been waiting all this time for someone to ask the right question. And if that moment ever comes, the story will change instantly. The name Nona Dirksmeyer will no longer be followed only by the words unsolved and cold case. There will be an answer. A sequence. A name established by evidence. A final explanation. But until that day, the honest story remains unfinished. Nona's murder has produced suspects. It has produced trials. It has produced accusations. It has produced acquittal. It has produced mistrials. But it has not produced the one thing that matters most. Certainty. And certainty cannot be created by repeating an accusation. It cannot be created by repeating a theory. It can only be created by evidence strong enough to withstand every reasonable challenge. That is the burden the case still carries. And that is why the question remains. More than 20 years later. More than 20 years after the emergency call. More than 20 years after the apartment became a crime scene. More than 20 years after investigators began asking the first questions. The final answer has still not arrived. But the file remains. The evidence remains. The memory remains. And somewhere within that unfinished record is the possibility that one day, someone will finally see what others could not. Connection. A contradiction. A trace. Fact. Something small enough to have been overlooked, but powerful enough to change everything. Until then, Nona's story remains suspended between the past and the present. The investigation ended in the courtroom. The mystery did not. And somewhere in Arkansas the question still waits. Who killed Nona Dirksmeyer?